Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and get started now. And what I'll ask people to do is go ahead and, rather than having a roll call with a conference call that involves people from a variety of places in the world and taking up the time to do that, what I'd like you to do is send Sarah Pickering an email if you're on the call and you're not using the WebEx feature. If you're using the WebEx feature, just go ahead and type at the bottom, as I will do right now. Just type at the bottom and send it. And you'll see that my name appears, and if you'll just go ahead and do that, for those people who are not showing up on the WebEx but are showing up just as call-in user and a number, just go ahead and let us know who you are, and an affiliation would be great also. I'll mention that again as we go forward a little bit. As in all of these conference calls, it takes a few minutes for people to get on board, and what I'll do is talk a little bit about the history of this of the Human Capital and Economic Development Network. And as we get into it a few minutes, then we'll go ahead and okay, Bill Ravel says he's not getting any audio. So, Sarah, can you provide some guidance to him?
Sure.
It may be that he's others seem to be able to hear me, but he's not, so he needs to get in touch with you. So, Bill,
I'll send him a message. Hold on.
Yeah, send him a message and ask him to give you a call.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's see. A little bit of background. First of all, as over the past 10 years, the importance of the early years in human capital development have become to be understood to be more and more important. And as that's happened, we've seen a strengthening of certainly all of concerns about human capital development from a competitive standpoint in the United States. And as a consequence of significant work by IMF, World Bank, and others, human capital as a priority in economic development is possibly a higher priority in developing countries than it is in the United States or other developed countries such as Japan or Europe. We are going to attempt to correct that in the United States and certainly have been working at it in a number of ways over the last 10 years with the work of a number of people. I'm not going to take time to list them all, but in our own area, the Invest in Kids Working Group, which started with a phone call between Art Rolnick and Jim Heckman and myself, that proceeded and became the Partnership for America's Economic Success. All focused on prenatal to 5, microeconomic, macroeconomic, sector definitions, financing, and advocacy. More recently, as a result of the kind of economic meltdown of 2007-2008, it's become quite clear that, in general, the profession of economics or the science of economics was unduly focused on ideas of rational expectations and efficient market hypotheses, such that the essential, more fundamental economic growth and development dimensions were not being attended to the degree they should. In the United States, this led to establishment of INET, the Institute for New Economic Thinking. That's ineteconomics.org, which is the principal funder of this Human Capital Economic Opportunity Working Group or Task Force that Jim Heckman chairs. Let me go ahead and open up this PowerPoint, and we'll begin to get underway. If you're not on the WebEx system, you can follow this PowerPoint by clicking on it on the Milton Friedman Institute. In the email I sent you, there's a link to it. And while it differs just slightly, because here in this PowerPoint we refer to it as the Youth Human Capital and Economic Development Network, and on that PowerPoint that's, I think, still on the website, it refers to it as a working group, and that's we're not going to call it that. It's going to be called the Youth Human Capital and Economic Development Network. It's global. There are members who are in Latin America, Africa, Europe, and Asia, as well as the United States. Let me just flip through very quickly to give you the background on the overall Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Project. This is chaired by Jim Heckman at the Milton Friedman Institute. Everyone of you know about Jim and his important work. He's on the call. I'll have a word from him in a moment. The working group has significant resources that Jim manages, and it consists of the overall working group plus these topical working groups or networks. We are now part of the Youth Human Capital Economic Development Network, and it's being led by me, Rob Duggar. I'm a recovering hedge fund partner. I have a small investment consulting firm, and I chair the advisory board of the Partnership for America's Economic Success. That organization is mainly focused on communicating to business how to advocate and understand and advocate for quality prenatal to 5 interventions. Today we're going to hear from Tim Barczyk. He's written a remarkable book which for the first time pulls together all the micro data or the major pieces of micro economic return information and expresses it through a fairly rigorous econometric process into comments about growth and development. When he's done, we'll go to Q&A. In general, here's the MFI Human Capital and Economic Working Group, the overall project. And what I'd like to do is, Jim Heckman, if you're on the line, if you would just say a word or two and an explanation of kind of what you're doing as head of this overall effort. Now, Sarah, do I have to transfer this to Jim?
Actually, no. I think he's asking. He is getting on currently. He might not quite be on yet, but I think he'll let us know when he is on.
Okay. Well, what I'm going to do is ask all of you just to read these pages because and also transmit this information to others who have an interest in human capital. In general, we focus on prenatal to 5 or prenatal to age 8. But our interests extend from the earliest months of conception to age 18, to a young adulthood. Each of these pages tells you kind of what the overall working group, Human Capital Economic Opportunity Project is about, ending inequality of opportunity and improving the quality of human capital development worldwide. We have very significant resources that Jim has available to him to convene working groups, meetings, seminars, and to build a global leadership group and network of researchers and policy people and applied experts in these areas. We are one of the topical networks. And these groups are expected to grow, and if you have interest in a particular one, you can join any one of you like. And you can join any one of you like, and if you want to form a new one, you're welcome to do that too. We'll host it on the website and do all the things that are necessary. At this point, we have 7 topical networks. Jim chairs the Early Childhood Interventions one. There's one on health, markets, measuring, interpreting inequality, identity and psychology, family inequality, and this one, youth human capital and economic development. Here's some information about this working group. I'm going to flip through here very quickly in order to get to Tim, get his views into the discussion so we can get to Q&A and complete this sort of background. Tim is one of the leading U.S. researchers on the linkages between human capital and economic growth and development. I've given you a link to his bio, and you're welcome and encouraged to take a look at it. Tim this morning is going to discuss econometric estimates of the effects of early child program spending on local and regional per capita income growth and economic development. This is the first, as I mentioned earlier, his book, The Investing in Kids, Early Child Programs and Local Economic Development. I'm guessing, Tim, that it took you about 5 or 6 years to put this book together. I know the effort was intensive in your work with the Partnership for America's Economic Success in the last 3 or 4 years in bringing this book forward, and we are all deeply in your debt for converting, for the first time, data on well-researched early child development, early child interventions, converting it and expressing it in terms of economic development and growth. So let me, Tim will, with more information about the specific items he'll discuss, and that concludes my summary overview. And what we'll do is Tim will go through his presentation. And then when I get an email that Jim is available, we'll hear from Jim. Then we'll go to Q&A on Tim's questions. Now, to speed up the question process, if you are on the WebEx system, type your questions at the bottom and send them. They all get sent to Allison Bowles, who is the sort of administrator of the...
Hello, this is Scott Koginski calling from Congressman Polis's office.
Very good. Glad you're on the call.
I was sorry I was unable to get in for a while, so...
That's okay. Glad you're here. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you want to follow, you're on the conference call, probably not on the WebEx system?
He is on the WebEx system. It was just taking a while for the audio to get set up.
Okay, very good. With those of you, if you have any background noise or anything, if you're on, you can just mute your phone. But to ask questions about Tim's work, for Tim to answer in the Q&A, type the question at the bottom of the WebEx, bottom lower right-hand corner. Send the question to Allison. It'll appear in the chat box, and Tim will be able to see the questions, and he'll group them and answer them point by point as he can towards after he finishes his presentation. So I'm going to stop now and pass the ball to Tim. And Tim, the show will be in your hands. There you are.
Okay. Aha. Okay, I'm going to switch to my PowerPoint. Good, that works. And if you're following the WebEx, the PowerPoint will be there. If you're not following the WebEx, I believe the PowerPoint is on the website of the Milton Friedman Institute. So what I'll try to do is spend 15 or 20 minutes just summarizing some of the key points from my recently published book, which Rob mentioned, Investing in Kids, Early Childhood Programs and Local Economic Development. By the way, I noticed Art Rolnick's on the phone call, and this book, to some extent, I think, or a large extent, is really an attempt to follow up on some ideas that he expressed some years back about looking at early childhood programs as economic development programs. In any event, the main point of the book is that if a U.S. state government invests in early childhood programs that are high quality, they can provide a payoff in benefits for a state's economic development that is the same or even greater per dollar invested than what states more traditionally do, which is mainly focused on business tax incentives. And the payoff is that these high-quality programs create higher per capita income for state residents. The primary mechanism for doing that is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily through higher quality labor supply of former child participants in these programs, Over 3/5 of these former child participants in early childhood programs will remain in the same state as adults, and therefore these programs, if they're run well, they'll increase the quality of the state's labor supply. Higher quality labor supply will encourage the creation of more and better jobs. Now, the U.S. context for this discussion is that state governments play the dominant role in setting both educational policy and economic development policy in the U.S. State governments, along with local governments, provide most of the funding and direction to education, and they're the major entity that directly tries to shape long-run economic development around the U.S. Now, to economists, it may seem obvious that economic development is affected by both the quantity and quality of both labor supply and labor demand, but this is by no means obvious to most non-economists, and in particular, it's not obvious to state policymakers, in particular to economic development policymakers. In the United States, state economic development policymakers mainly focus on pursuing economic development by the use of state tax policy, and in particular, they focus on discretionary tax incentives to attract potentially mobile businesses. Now, this is based, I think, on the common sense notion that the goal of economic development at the state level is simply to attract jobs, and jobs are thought to be most directly affected by business taxes. But when you look at it from a benefit-cost standpoint, the real benefit, jobs are really only a proximate goal of state economic development policy at best. Benefits for state residents must ultimately consist of some state resident getting higher real income. In the case of job growth, the real benefit of increasing job growth, over 2/3 of the benefits of job growth are the increase in per capita earnings of state residents due to higher employment rates or higher wage rates. And once you start thinking about economic development as really being aimed at earnings per capita rather than simply job growth, it becomes quickly apparent to any labor economist anyway that you can achieve that goal by working either the supply side of the labor market or the demand side of the labor market. You can either increase the quantity or quality of labor demand for state residents or the quantity and quality of the labor supply of state residents. So demand side economic development policies include state tax incentives. Supply side economic development incentives include early childhood programs. Now, which of those approaches works better? And in my book, I show that both of them can yield similar payoffs from a state perspective. Per dollar invested, both well-designed business tax incentives and well-designed early childhood programs can increase per capita earnings for state residents, the present value of per capita earnings for state residents, by about $2 to $3 per dollar invested. Now, behind these benefit cost calculations, this is all presented in much more detail in my book, are many elasticities or impact estimates from the research literature. So on the demand side, this includes how the businesses respond to business tax incentives at the state level, how the state employment rates and wage rates respond over time to labor demand shocks at the state level. And on the supply side, these elasticities include how do early childhood programs affect adult outcomes, how many adults will stay in the same state, and how does job growth at the state level respond to labor supply shocks. Now, one of the surprising elasticities, I think, that makes early childhood programs pay off is how large the adult outcome effects are of even quite time-limited early childhood programs. And I think it's important to keep, skeptics would say, how on earth could 1 year of half-day preschool during the school year have dramatic effects on adult earnings? And I think the reason why it has dramatic effect, the best theory of that is really the theory that Jim Heckman has pushed, probably most prominently, that these programs develop soft skills, so-called social skills, skills of dealing with peers, dealing with authority figures such as teachers, self-confidence, the ability to plan. And these soft skills end up being self-generating over time and lead to further increase in soft skills and hard skills. And it's that effect on soft skills that probably is the key to these programs having such dramatic effects on adult outcomes over time. Another surprising elasticity is the fact that so many Americans, we tend to think of Americans as being very mobile, and they are in many ways, but many state residents will stay in the same state for most of their working careers. So if you look at data, about at least 3/5 of all Americans, for most of their working career, will be in the state they lived in as a child. And this percentage doesn't vary much by state, varies some, doesn't even vary that much with local economic conditions. And presumably this reflects the fact that workers have ties to both familiar people and places in their home state. Now, there are a number of issues discussed in the book that are relevant to the desirability of supply-side economic development policies such as early childhood programs compared to more traditional business practices. Let me just focus on a few of them. One issue is, I mentioned that in order for these programs to have these impacts, they need to be high quality, but the question is, what is high quality in early childhood programs? And we know something, but not as much as we would like. We know that smaller class sizes help in preschool, although lower child staff ratios aren't as important. The overall class size seems to be important, but not so much the child staff ratio. Better teachers help, but there's a lot of controversy over what the relationship exactly is of credentials to quality teaching. That's quite contested as an issue. We know that even slight improvements in the quality of teacher-child relationships in preschool classrooms and in child care can significantly increase test scores, and even slight early improvements in test scores can significantly raise adult earnings. So quality matters a lot. We have some knowledge that quality varies quite a bit across different sites and programs. And we know that while the federal Head Start program has many effective centers, some of the most cost-effective early childhood programs are at the state and local level. So, I think this argues that although we know enough about early childhood programs to know that they can pay off and that therefore there is some merit in pursuing these at a large scale, we don't know perfectly how they work. So therefore, there is certainly a need for considerable local flexibility and innovation. But if that local flexibility and innovation is really the lead to increased knowledge, we need to have ongoing, rigorous evaluation of results. And in looking at how can you combine large-scale implementation with rigorous evaluation, I think one of the most promising methodologies for doing that, at least in the case of preschool, is various studies have used what's called regression discontinuity analysis of preschool programs. This has been done, for example, by Bill Gormley and his colleagues at Georgetown, as well as Steve Barnett and his colleagues at Rutgers. And this has been applied to many state preschool programs. And the basic idea is comparing performance on the same test at preschool entrants and at kindergarten entrants of former preschool participants. These two groups are similar, and particularly they're both similar in having been selected into the preschool program. They only differ in whether or not they made the age cutoff for preschool. And so you can adjust for that, and what you expect to see, and this graph just shows some hypothetical data, where you see a jump in test scores for kids who are just old enough to experience a year of preschool versus kids who were younger, just a little bit younger than that, and therefore are just enrolling in preschool for the first time in that fall. A second issue with high-quality early childhood programs and their payoff in economic development is the fact that whether they offer sufficiently large short-term benefits to be attractive to state politicians. Obviously, we're not taking preschoolers at age 4 and putting the labor force at age 5. So a lot of the benefits in terms of increased earnings take 15, 20 years to occur. And in contrast, the benefits of business tax incentives, if they're successful, are quite immediate. The jobs are created now, the earnings are created now, as this graph shows. The benefits of business tax incentives are quite large in the short term. In the long term, the early childhood programs really show up a lot better. Now, are there some possible short-term benefits of early childhood programs? There are, and there are a number of them, and I discussed them in the book. Let me just mention two briefly this morning. One is the potential savings in special education costs due to reduced special education assignments due to early childhood programs. Special ed is quite expensive. $10,000 a year is not an unusual figure for special ed costs. In the book, I did some calculations for universal preschool programs. If you look at how a high-quality universal preschool program might affect special ed costs, the immediate effect as the first cohort enters kindergarten is to lower special ed costs enough to offset about 4% of the cost of the preschool program. And that accumulates as that cohort goes to the K-12 system over the next 13 years until it eventually is about 48% of program cost. Targeted programs do even better than that. Targeted preschool programs, since a higher percentage of that group would be in special ed, and since these programs have somewhat higher effects if they're targeted, potentially the immediate cost savings in kindergarten is 17% of the cost of the program, and over time those can go up to over 200%. It can more than cover program cost after 13 years. A second type of short-term benefit I want to mention is effects on property values. We know that parents and other home buyers are willing to pay more for higher quality school, at least as measured by higher elementary test scores. And we know from a number of studies that have compared similar houses, similar neighbors, except the elementary school test scores vary. And if you simply take the effects of high-quality preschool on elementary test scores, and if you take then the effects of test scores on property values, I calculate in the book that a preschool program, simply due to the effects of elementary test scores, could raise property values by about 13 times the annual program cost of preschool. Now, if instead of assuming we're just looking at test score effects of preschool, we actually looked at all the earnings effects of preschool, which of course are, well, not of course, but they are higher than simply what you would predict based on effects of third-grade test scores. You might get that with full capitalization of earnings effects, you might get effects on property values of as much as 80 times annual program cost. Now, actually, of course, the exact property value increase you can get it depends on what specific assumptions you make, and we certainly do need to do more research on exactly how property values do respond to preschool quality. A third issue with early childhood programs is their distributional effects and how that compares to the distributional effects of business tax incentives. Now, business tax incentives have modestly progressive effects on the income distribution. They do help the unemployed. They do increase the earnings of the low-income groups by a somewhat higher percentage than other groups. However, their absolute earnings effects of business tax incentives on lower-income groups are limited because, one, these groups tend to be less competitive for obtaining new jobs. And when they do obtain new jobs, they tend to work at lower wages. But even though, as I said, they are modestly progressive. In contrast, under from fairly plausible distributional assumptions, even universal preschool programs will have highly progressive distributional effects, much higher for lower-income groups than for middle-income groups, and much higher for middle-income groups than upper-income groups. So preschool, universal preschool or other early childhood programs do a lot more in terms of building broad-based economic development than is true of business tax incentives. And that's because they directly target increasing the skills of lower-skilled groups, and that gets at some of the limitations of that business incentives have. If you're just creating jobs but not affecting skills, that limits what you can do in terms of distributional effects. Now, a closely related issue that's been much debated is should we have universal programs or targeted programs. Now, this really isn't an issue for most early childhood programs. For most early childhood programs that are very expensive per kid per year, no one's really advocating that all children should be in these programs. It's really only an issue for some of the more modestly priced preschool programs, half-day programs for 1 year for 4-year-olds. And there the issue is certainly very hotly debated. I think there's, if you look at the different distributional effects, there's actually some difficult political trade-offs here. The return per dollar is probably higher from targeted pre-K because you are investing where you have the return the highest, and the return so programs are cheaper to run. So in the book I calculate the return per dollar for targeted pre-K can be $7 per dollar invested from the perspective of a state government. On the other hand, universal pre-K provides more benefits to the middle class, or at least under plausible distributional assumptions can provide those benefits. So there is those benefits to the middle class are significant economically, and they can obviously be significant politically. Now, there's not really a lot of firm empirical evidence on the effects of preschool on middle-income and upper-income groups. The best evidence I know is from Bill Gormley's studies of universal preschool in Tulsa. Those studies suggest that the Oklahoma program seems to yield large test score effects at kindergarten entrance for children from all income groups. The effects are somewhat larger for low-income groups, but not much larger. However, we certainly need more evidence from other states, as well as from, it would be nice to have some further evidence from longer-term studies of preschool's benefits for middle-class kids. A fourth point that my book talks about that's an issue with looking at early childhood programs versus business incentives is the difference between the state perspective and the national perspective on these programs. Now, in the case of business tax incentives, we know that many of the jobs created in the state by business and tax incentives would otherwise have been located somewhere else in the U.S. Therefore, the benefits from a national perspective of a state's tax incentives for that state are largely offset by a loss of jobs in other states in the nation. So the national benefits will be much lower than state benefits. In contrast with state programs, once you count the benefits from the about one-third of child participants who will end up spending most of their work career in some other state, benefits actually go up by about a third. So from a national perspective, universal pre-K has larger benefits than from a state perspective. And that's also true for other early childhood programs as well. Now, in the case of business tax incentives, the fact that national benefits are so much lower than state benefits suggests that federal policy should seek to restrict or regulate state use of such incentives. Since I know Art Rolnick was on the call, Art has long been an advocate for doing that, and it's interesting that the European Union already regulates this much more than the U.S. does. I mean, in the European Union, a lot of what states do in economic development would be illegal, would be considered a legal form of export subsidies within the European Union context. And if we adopted the European Union's regulations, a lot of what states do could not be done. In the case of early childhood programs, the higher national benefits and state benefits provides a potential rationale for a federal subsidy of early childhood programs. The issue, however, I think, is how do you do that federal subsidy if you're going to do it, and yet retain the needed flexibility and innovation you need at the state level. So you don't want to move to a federal subsidy where the feds control it. Anyway, let me summarize my main points. High-quality early childhood programs, I think, should be an important part of state economic development strategies. Why? Because they're a cost-effective way of providing support for a broad-based economic development that not only includes all income groups, it actually provides larger benefits to lower and moderate income groups. And that's a benefit of these programs compared to traditional business incentives. Although a lot of the benefits are long-term, they do provide some important short-term benefits, which should be attractive to state policymakers, such as special ed cost savings and increased property values. However, in order to make these early childhood programs of high quality and make them of continuous improving quality, we need to encourage local flexibility and innovation, while at the same time rigorously evaluating outcomes. There's the old cliche that states should be laboratories of democracy, but if no one bothers to do a good job of measuring the results in laboratories, then that doesn't work out so well. So just letting states do what they want without evaluation is not particularly a good strategy. And finally, the federal role, I think, therefore, should be to consider regulations to discourage economic development strategies that are, to some extent, zero-sum games, or at least not 100% sum games, strategies that overemphasize business tax incentives, while at the same time encouraging early childhood programs, and particularly encouraging these programs in a way that encourages innovation and encourages rigorous evaluation. Let me just stop there and see what questions or discussion there is. Do I need to pass it back to you, or should I keep it with me, Rob?
Yeah, why don't you pass it back to me?
Okay, let's see. Where are you, though? I can't find your...
Up at the top, above you.
Oh, above me?
Yes.
There he is. There you are, but how do I find your... I'm trying to click at the Allison. I can't find you.
No, you clicked. Well, I don't.
Oh, here you are. No, you moved down. Here you are.
Okay.
There you go.
Fine. Thanks, Tim and everyone. Let me mention we're in the Q&A session now. I don't know if Jim Heckman is on the call or not. Jim, if you are, step right in and let me know. Okay. Let me mention, Tim, with respect to the estimates you mentioned, Oklahoma and Texas, we also have projects underway in Utah, Colorado, and Minnesota. Art Rolnick's MELF program is being actively evaluated, and we should have results of its elementary school, K through elementary school benefits fairly soon. Similarly, Janice Dubno is conducting similar kind of work focused specifically on the effects of quality pre-kindergarten on reducing special education costs in Salt Lake City, Utah. Another project similar to it run by Lindsay Dolce is being done in Boulder, Colorado. So I would mention that as a follow-on work along the lines that you talked about. This is the time to raise questions or comments about Tim's work. So either type the questions in or just take your phone off mute and talk to us.
Rob, it's Art Rolnick. Tim, one quick question.
Go ahead.
How is your book being received? What kind of feedback have you, in particular from Washington, on your analysis? Are you getting buy-in? Are you getting pushback?
I don't know if I've gotten a lot of feedback per se from Washington. I've gotten a lot of favorable feedback, obviously, from the early childhood community.
Sure.
And a lot of people invited me to speak at conferences. And I think I've gotten some favorable feedback from business people I've talked to about it. I have not heard. I mean, I think Washington is right now focused on issues related to budget deficits and health care and a bunch of other stuff, and not so much on this issue. But I think at the state level, this is obviously being very actively debated, as I'm sure you know, Art, and I'm sure many other people know. Basically, a lot of the state programs that increased during, since 2000, state pre-K programs and whatnot, are facing threats of significant budget cutbacks. And exactly the situation varies from state to state. I know of significant efforts to cut back these programs in Iowa, Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, New Jersey. There's some documentation of this, and they just issued state preschool yearbook from National Institute for Early Education Research that showed some drop in state, particularly worrisome, a big drop in state funding per kid, because it looks like to some extent when states are cutting, some of them are cutting more by cutting funding per kid and not the number of kids, which I think in the long term is going to undermine quality. Not that there's a one-to-one correlation between funding per kid and quality, because there isn't, but certainly there's concern that some of these programs may end up being reduced in funding to such an extent that they're really not making a significant difference for the participants.
Art, anything else?
Oh, that's good.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Tim.
Janice Dubno from
Lindsay Dolce. Hi, Tim. How are you?
Fine.
Good. Hey, listen, I was wondering what sort of feedback have you gotten around the piece about special education savings and then the increased property values? I know when we were in Chicago and last spoke that was sort of a point of contention for some folks, so I'm curious to know kind of what the feedback has been around.
Well, people are very interested in that. I think one of the things we really do need, though, is to get accurate measures of what those cost savings are. I've seen some numbers out there for cost savings that I think are not quite believable. I mean, in other words, you can't assume that every kid who went through preschool would have. I mean, you can get huge cost savings if you make a little unreasonable assumptions. So I do think one thing we really need to do is get this pinned down a lot more. What are the exact special ed costs and exactly how much is saved from these programs? We have some data on this from the existing studies. I think it'd be great if some of the ongoing studies of real-world state preschool or, for that matter, locally funded preschool programs would monitor this much more carefully and document what those cost savings are. And, of course, it's not only special ed. I'm almost using it as a stand-in for a host of different savings that are out there. I mean, there are also other remedial programs. Special ed just deserves mention because the costs of it are so high per kid that it tends to dominate some of the cost-saving calculations. And property values people are very interested in. And you see people making this argument. The Iowa Business Council testified against the cutbacks in state preschool programs in that state. And one of their arguments is that they had found, and the Iowa Business Council is a group of, represents the 20 largest employers in Iowa. And one of their arguments when they testified before the Iowa State Senate was that they had found that Iowa's funded preschool program was something that helped attract, when they were trying to attract employees to Iowa, they found that program to be a plus. So I think that's consistent with the argument that these programs not only have benefits from benefiting the kids, but the parents value these benefits, and it affects their mobility, it affects their behavior.
Tim, can I ask some more? This is Steve Ross. I was wondering if I could ask some more questions about these preschool results, which I haven't seen before.
Sure.
In the education literature, one of the big concerns right now is fade-out. Models where people have estimated value-added effects of teachers, for example, or a variety of other programmatic effects. We often, I know the teacher effects in terms of test scores often fade out over 2 years, for example. And so with the special ed sort of type effects, if there is fade out, there is this sort of interesting possible concern that you get somebody in preschool, you get them in a good enough shape that they sort of don't get into the special ed system, then after these effects sort of fade out, now they should be in the special ed system, maybe they're not getting the services they need. And I don't know whether there's been any study, whether you've looked particularly at fade out in terms of what the skills are that are possibly preventing entry into special ed, and whether these are sort of permanent gains or temporary gains.
I don't know of any study specifically that looks at that, and that's certainly worth looking at. I guess the fade out, as I said, I mean, in the case of preschool and early childhood programs, there often is some fade out in terms of test score effects that measure math and reading skill effects. The fade out seems to be less in some of these behavioral things about whether kids are retained in grade or whether they graduate on time and that kind of thing. So, and again, most of that discussion attributes that to soft skills. So I do think people have looked at, fade out and concluded that for a lot of high-quality early childhood programs, there are sizable long-term effects, even when some of the cognitive test scores fade out. I do not know of any study that specifically looked at the issue you raised, which is essentially there may be issues if special ed assignments go down in cases where it's inappropriate, where maybe there would have been a benefit from having the special ed assignment be made earlier. I do not know of any studies showing an increase later on after early reductions in special ed.
Hi, Tim. This is Jenna Stepnew in Salt Lake. A comment and a question. Since ESEA reauthorization is coming up, I think your book is really timely. And I think it would be really important for policymakers, particularly to see the national impact of universal pre-K so that they can consider incentives in ESEA reauthorization. And that's just a comment. So I'm hoping that every member of the HELP committee is getting a copy of your book. The second is I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relative merits of the regression discontinuity method versus a randomized control experiment. Did you favor the former in the absence of the latter, or do you think there's some analytical benefit to doing the regression discontinuity method versus a randomized controlled experiment?
Well, I mean, here they have different strengths and weaknesses. The strength of randomized controlled trials is that it allows for very precise estimates of both short-term and long-term outcomes. The disadvantage is randomized controlled trials are expensive to run, hard to do on an ongoing program, particularly one on a large scale. And of course, from the randomized controlled trial, you don't find, if you want to know effects, the long-term effects, you have to wait around until the long-term occurs. And so there's a sizable opportunity cost for waiting around for that. My advocacy for randomized for regression discontinuity, I think regression discontinuity is something you can do on an ongoing basis as part of a large-scale implementation of preschool. You don't have to necessarily have all the ethical issues and practical issues of implementing random assignment. The other issue with regression discontinuity, the only thing that regression discontinuity requires you to do is somewhat odd, certainly in education context, is you have to give the same test to both entering preschoolers and entering kindergartners, which is a little bit weird. But you can certainly do that. And but it's something I see regression discontinuity strength is allowing you to do ongoing evaluation of large-scale programs implemented at the state level. I see no reason why every state preschool program couldn't do regression discontinuity evaluation of samples of classrooms around the state. And at least it tells you what the short-term test score impacts of these programs are. Does it tell you long-term impacts? No. Regression discontinuity will not tell you long-term impacts unless you want to extrapolate from the test score impacts. All it tells you is short-term test score impacts, but it allows you to do that on an ongoing basis for large-scale programs from around the country in a much cheaper way than is possible for randomized controlled trials.
Great. Thank you.
Sarah Watson, you've got your hand up.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to pass on some plans about further publicizing Tim Bartik's book in response to a few folks' comments about getting this in front of members of Congress. We are developing a 4-page brief that brings out some of the key findings, such as the difference between state and federal, state and national returns for the 3 early childhood programs and business tax incentives, and the real estate findings in a brief that will be easy to skim. So we will make sure that that brief gets in front of
Sarah, who is we?
I'm sorry, this is Sarah Watson with the Pew Charitable Trust. Thank you, Rob. And so we're very happy to be a funder of Tim's work. So we will formally release the brief at our National Business Leaders Summit in July and have a communications firm that is working on doing a press outreach around the brief, and we will certainly send that to every member of Congress. I think it's more likely that the staff members or even the members themselves will skim through a brief, but probably not the whole book. And so Tim will be speaking at the National Business Leaders Summit, so we will invite members of the press to talk with him around that event and the release of the brief, and hoping to get kind of a second wave. I will note that Tim has been tireless in terms of getting information about his book out here. He's really a terrific model of a researcher who cares about the degree to which people in the policy sphere, not just the academic sphere, read and use his materials. He's truly too modest to say this, so I'm going to say it for him. He has a terrific blog. He really prepared for this. He has it's actually available on Amazon, and any of you who'd be willing to write a review on Amazon, that will always help sales. So I'm going to ask on his behalf, and I want to thank the people on the call, such as Rob and Anart, who wrote briefs for the book. We have gotten a nice amount of media coverage on the book, and we are hoping that the release of the brief prompts more people to cover it in the media because of this more accessible, easy to skim piece of information. So just want to let people know that, yes, we are aware of the need to work to get the press and policymakers to pay attention to this great piece of work.
Tim Barney, I wanted to thank Sarah for that, and I should have acknowledged at the outset, of course, all this research. As Rob mentioned, I started working on this in 2005 with some funding from the Committee for Economic Development, which I later on found out they were being in turn funded by Pew, and Pew has supported this work, for the last 5 or 6 years that I've done on this, and I really appreciate both their support as well as they provide the opportunity to speak on this at various national and state venues, and also we're trying to publicize this in various ways. I think we can also mention one thing I know that Sarah and I worked on, where I'm speaking in August at the national meeting of the Association of Chamber of Commerce Executives. So
yep, and that's from a grant that we gave them as well.
Right, so that's reaching out to local business leaders around the country. And, some people get this. I mean, I've talked to different business leaders. Some people really get this, that this is important to the future of their states. And, I think we need to talk, in talking about affecting policymakers, you need to go beyond simply, I think we need to talk about congressional staff and legislative staff. We also need to talk about some of the people who influence policy, such as business leadership.
Tim, we are working hard on that, certainly through the Partnership for America's Economic Success, and increasingly other groups who work with business groups are making sure that the business community understands that the book's there, and it is about the number one concern of most chambers of commerce across the country is local development. And I think that this is I know for a fact, it's the first time they've ever seen anything like this, and I'm not surprised that you're getting more input from the business community, or you're getting a lot of input from the business community. At this point, as that develops, you'll soon after that get recognition and input from the policy community. We've got just a few minutes left, and what I'd like to do is ask if there's any more questions from anyone or comments before asking Jim Heckman to make a few comments about the overall work of this Milton Friedman task force. It's worldwide. Jim was telling me last night, there are over 300 members of the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Task Force, and these members are everywhere in the world, from across the Latin America, South Asia, Europe, and of course the United States and Canada. Any comments for a few minutes before I turn it over to Jim? Okay, hearing none. Jim, can you hear me? Or have you got your phone muted? Well, he is on the line, I happen to know, but he may not be able to unmute. So let me ask again if there are other questions or comments from other people.
You might just want to remind him *6 in case the directions aren't right in front of him.
Okay, yes, *6 to unmute your phone. Or maybe it's #6. Well, Jim? Jim?
I had a problem once where I *6 had muted it, and I thought #6 had unmuted it. But I'm just trying to remember from a month ago when you had your first phone call.
Okay, well, let's try, Jim, if you're on the line, try #6 to unmute. Well, I know he had a very busy schedule this morning, so maybe he has a meeting that he's actually had to leave for. He's been battling the call-in number for the last half hour or so, but we'll get him on the next time. Jim has built as you can see from the website, a very substantial network of people, particularly in the early childhood intervention network. I think that one's over 100 people. This one, as we expand out and begin to make this case for investing in kids early in their lives as a strategy for economic development, I expect more and more people will see more and more research. For the next conference call of this group in 90 days, we will be hearing from people at the World Bank and the work that they're doing worldwide, which is confirming that investments early in childhood are having powerful economic development and income inequality and opportunity, powerful positive economic opportunity effects. So we look forward to that. It's principally the work of Jacques van der Jacques, formerly at the World Bank, who wrote a book, a very powerful paper with Jack Shonkoff, and then around the world tour talking about investing in kids and the neuroscience as a case for countries to develop resources. That work has had the effect of rising requests for Jim Heckman to come, and he's been speaking in Asia, the Middle East, and very, very actively in Latin America. They, in many respects, Latin American governments are zeroing in on this priority as an economic development strategy to a far greater degree than the United States. So our hope as a result of this network's efforts that we can get the United States to focus on it with the same degree of intensity. We have a few minutes left. Let me check again to see if anyone has any questions or comments. Hearing none, we generally stop on time. It looks like today will end a little bit before the end of the time. Thanks all of you for joining us, and we'll see you in another 90 days or so. Keep in mind, we will be rotating the time zone of the phone calls to make it easier for European and particularly Asian members to join us. So with that, I'll bring it to a close and thank all of you for joining us this morning. Thank you, and bye-bye.